My name is Jesse Owens, though my mama named me James Cleveland Owens when I came into this world on the 12th of September, 1913, in Oakville, Alabama. Growing up as the grandson of slaves in the Deep South, I learned early that the color of my skin would determine much about my life's journey. But I also learned something else from watching my father work the cotton fields from dawn to dusk, that determination could carry a man further than circumstances might suggest. When I was 9 years old, our family packed what little we owned and joined the Great Migration north to Cleveland, Ohio. My father had heard there were jobs in the factories, real paying jobs that might give his children a chance at something better. I remember the excitement mixed with fear as we boarded that train, leaving behind the only world I'd ever known. In Cleveland, everything was different, yet somehow the same. Yes, there were more opportunities, but the lines of segregation were drawn just as firmly, if more subtly. It was at Fairmount Junior High School that my life took its first decisive turn. The gym teacher, Charles Riley, noticed something in the way I moved. He saw me running to catch the streetcar one morning, and later that day, he pulled me aside. "Son," he said, "you've got speed in those legs that most folks can only dream of. How would you like to learn to run properly?" Coach Riley became more than just a teacher to me. He became the father figure who saw potential where others saw just another poor black kid from the South. He couldn't afford to pay me for the after-school job I needed to help my family, so he trained me before school started each morning. While other kids were still sleeping, I was on that track at 7 a.m., learning to harness what God had given me. The first time I broke a school record, I felt something I'd never experienced before, the pure joy of excellence. It wasn't just about being fast. It was about proving that despite where I came from, despite the color of my skin, I could be the best at something. That feeling became addictive. By the time I reached East Technical High School, word about my speed had spread throughout Cleveland. Coach Edgar Weil took over my training, and under his guidance, I began to understand that my talent wasn't just a gift, it was a responsibility. Every time I stepped onto that track, I wasn't just representing myself, I was representing my family, my community, and every black person who had been told they weren't good enough. The competition was fierce, but I thrived under pressure. In 1933, during my senior year, I set my first world record at the National High School Championships in Chicago. Running the 220-yard dash, I crossed the finish line in 20.7 seconds, breaking the existing world record. The crowd's roar was deafening, but what struck me most was the silence that followed, that moment when everyone, regardless of their prejudices, had to acknowledge what they had just witnessed. That record opened doors I never could have imagined. College recruiters started showing up at our modest home on Cleveland's east side. My mother would serve them coffee in our best china, the set she'd saved for years to buy, while they talked about scholarships and opportunities. Ohio State University offered me a scholarship, and despite the fact that I'd still face segregation there, I couldn't live in the dormitories with white students, couldn't eat in the same restaurants, couldn't even stay in the same hotels when we traveled for meets. I knew this was my chance to make something of myself. At Ohio State, I quickly earned the nickname the Buckeye Bullet. Coach Larry Snyder saw in me not just an athlete, but a young man who could transcend the sport itself. He pushed me harder than anyone ever had, but he also protected me from the worst of the discrimination I faced daily. The campus was a microcosm of America in the 1932nd. In classes, some professors would barely acknowledge my presence, while others seemed surprised when I demonstrated intelligence beyond their expectations. Fellow students would sometimes cross the street to avoid walking near me, while others cheered my name from the stands during track meets. It was a constant reminder that my excellence was both celebrated and resented. But it was on May 25, 1935. at the Big Ten Championships in Ann Arbor, Michigan, that I truly announced myself to the world. I was recovering from a back injury sustained earlier that week, and many thought I shouldn't even compete. Coach Snyder left the decision up to me. "Jesse," he said, "you don't have anything to prove to anyone. You've already accomplished more than most athletes dream of." But something inside me knew this was bigger than just another track meet. I could feel history waiting for me on that track. In the span of 45 minutes, I broke 3 world records and tied a 4th. First, I ran the 100-yard dash in 9.4 seconds, tying the world record. 10 minutes later, I long jumped 26 feet 8 1/4 inches, a record that would stand for 25 years. 20 minutes after that, I ran the 220-yard dash in 20.3 seconds, breaking my own world record. And finally, I ran the 220-yard low hurdles in 22.6 seconds, another world record. The crowd at Ferry Field was stunned into silence, then erupted in applause that seemed to go on forever. Reporters called it the greatest 45 minutes in sports history. But for me, it was something more profound. It was the moment I realized that excellence could be a form of resistance, that by being undeniably great, I could force America to confront its own contradictions. As 1936 approached, talk began to build about the Olympics in Berlin. Adolf Hitler was using the Games as a showcase for his theories of Aryan supremacy, and American newspapers were filled with debates about whether we should even participate. For me, the decision was both simple and complicated. Simple because I had worked my entire life for this moment, the chance to compete against the world's best athletes on the biggest stage possible. Complicated because I would be doing so in Nazi Germany, under the watchful eyes of a regime that viewed people like me as subhuman. The irony wasn't lost on me that I would face less discrimination in Nazi Germany than I did in many parts of my own country. At least, Hitler's hatred was honest and open. In America, it was often hidden behind smiles and separate but equal laws. The U.S. Olympic team trials were held at Randall's Island in New York. I qualified in 3 individual events, the 100 meters, 200 meters, and long jump, and was selected for the 4x 100-meter relay team. As I packed my bags for Germany, my mother pulled me aside. "Son," she said, her eyes filling with tears, "you carry all of us with you. Show them what we're made of." The journey to Berlin was surreal. Here I was, a two-year-old kid from Alabama, about to compete in front of Adolf Hitler himself. The other American athletes were nervous, but they were worried about performance. I was worried about that too, but also about much more, about representing my race, my country, and the possibility that sports could be a bridge across the deepest divides of human hatred. The 3rd of August, 1936. The day of my first event, the 100 meters. I had barely slept the night before, not from nerves about the race, but from the weight of what it represented. As I walked into the Olympic Stadium, 110,000 people were on their feet. Many were cheering, but I could see the swastikas everywhere, constant reminders of where I was and what I represented to the Nazi ideology. In the tunnel before we entered the track, I closed my eyes and thought about Coach Riley, who had first seen something special in a 9-year-old boy running for a streetcar. I thought about my family back in Cleveland, probably gathered around the radio. I thought about every black person in America who had been told they weren't good enough, fast enough, smart enough. The race itself was over in 10.3 seconds, an Olympic record. As I crossed the finish line, I felt a mixture of elation and defiance. I had just proven, in Hitler's own backyard, that his theories of racial superiority were nothing but dangerous lies. 3 days later came the long jump, and with it, one of the most significant moments of my life. I was struggling in the preliminary rounds, fouling on my first 2 attempts. One more foul, and I would be eliminated before the finals. The pressure was enormous. This was supposed to be my strongest event. That's when something remarkable happened. A tall, blonde German athlete approached me. His name was Luz Long, and he was my main competition for the gold medal. In perfect English, he said, "Hello, Jesse Owens. I know who you are, and I know you're having trouble. May I make a suggestion?" Here was this German athlete, in front of his own people and his own Führer, offering to help the black American who was supposed to represent everything his country stood against. He suggested I jump from a few inches behind the takeoff board to ensure I didn't foul. His advice worked. I qualified for the finals and went on to win the gold medal with an Olympic record jump of 26 feet, 5 3/8 inches. Luz finished second, and as we stood on the medal podium, he was the first to congratulate me, putting his arm around my shoulders in full view of the Nazi leadership. Later, he told me, "You know, Jesse, what you did today, it was about more than just jumping far. It was about showing that friendship and sportsmanship are more powerful than hatred." Luz Long became one of my closest friends, though our friendship would be tragically cut short when he was killed fighting for Germany in World War II. But in that moment, on that field in Berlin, two young men from different worlds proved that human decency could triumph over the poison of racism. The newspapers made much of the fact that Hitler left the stadium before my victories, refusing to congratulate me personally. They called it the snub heard round the world. But what they didn't talk about much was the snub I received when I returned home to America. Yes, there was a ticker tape parade in New York City, and yes, people cheered my name in the streets. But when the celebration ended, I was still a black man in 1936 America. I still couldn't eat in many restaurants, still couldn't stay in many hotels, still faced discrimination in employment, despite being the most famous athlete in the world. The cruelest irony came when I was invited to a reception at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York. I had to ride the freight elevator because black people weren't allowed to use the passenger elevators. At my own celebration, I was reminded of my place in the racial hierarchy of my own country. President Franklin D. Roosevelt never invited me to the White House, never called to congratulate me, never acknowledged publicly what I had accomplished for American prestige on the world stage. It was a painful reminder that my victories, as meaningful as they were to me and to black Americans everywhere, hadn't fundamentally changed how I was viewed by the white establishment. But something had changed inside me. I had tasted what it felt like to be judged purely on merit, to have my humanity acknowledged through my excellence. And I was determined to use that experience to open doors for others. The years following the Olympics were a struggle in ways I hadn't expected. Despite my fame, opportunities were limited for a black athlete in the 1,932nd and 1,942nd. I tried professional running, racing against horses and motorcycles in exhibitions that, while entertaining crowds, felt degrading to someone who had reached the pinnacle of athletic achievement. I opened a dry cleaning business that failed. I worked as a playground instructor. I tried my hand at various ventures, most of which fell short of providing the financial security I needed for my growing family. It was frustrating to be the fastest man in the world, but unable to translate that into economic success. But I began to understand that my real purpose wasn't just to run fast, it was to run toward a better future for others. I started speaking at schools, particularly those in black communities, talking to young people about the power of excellence, the importance of education, and the possibility that they, too, could exceed the expectations that society had set for them. One conversation in particular stays with me. I was speaking at a high school in Detroit when a young girl raised her hand and asked, "Mr. Owens, do you think what you did really changed anything? I mean, are things really different now?" I paused, thinking about all the doors that were still closed, all the barriers that still existed. But then I thought about Luz Long, about the 110,000 people who had cheered for me in Berlin, about the letters I received from young people around the world who told me I had inspired them to believe in themselves. "Young lady," I said, "change doesn't happen all at once. It happens one mind at a time, one heart at a time, one person at a time, deciding that they won't accept the limitations others try to place on them." Did I change everything? Number. But I helped prove that excellence has no color, and that's a start. As the civil rights movement gained momentum in the 1952nd and 1962nd, I found myself in a complicated position. Some activists criticized me for not being more outspoken, for not using my platform more aggressively to challenge segregation and discrimination. They saw my approach as too accommodating, too willing to work within the system rather than tear it down. I understood their frustration, but I also believed that my role was different from theirs. While others fought in the courts and in the streets, and thank God they did, I fought on the track and in the minds of people who might never have questioned their prejudices if they hadn't seen a black man run faster than any human being ever had. I thought about Jackie Robinson, who broke baseball's color barrier in 1947. We often talked about the burden of representation, about how every mistake we made was seen as a reflection on our entire race, while every success was dismissed as an exception. It was exhausting, but it was also a privilege to be in a position where our excellence could challenge people's assumptions. The younger generation of athletes, like Muhammad Ali and John Carlos and Tommy Smith, chose more direct forms of protest. When Carlos and Smith raised their fists on the medal podium at the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City, some people asked me what I thought. I said I understood their anger and their desire to make a statement, even if I might have chosen a different approach. The truth is, there's no single way to fight injustice. Some people march, some people write, some people sing, and some people run fast enough to force the world to pay attention. We all had our roles to play. In my later years, I often reflected on what those 4 gold medals in Berlin really meant. Yes, they were a repudiation of Hitler's racial theories. Yes, they were a moment of pride for Black Americans during a dark period in our history. But I came to understand that their deeper significance was in what they represented about human potential. Every time a young person, black, white, brown, or any other color, saw what I accomplished and thought, maybe I can do something great too, that was when those medals truly mattered. Every time someone refused to accept the limitations that society tried to place on them because they remembered that a sharecropper's son from Alabama had once been the fastest man in the world, that was when my running had served its highest purpose. I started the Jesse Owens Foundation to provide scholarships and support to young people, particularly those from disadvantaged backgrounds. I wanted to create opportunities for others that I had been forced to create for myself. I wanted to be the Coach Riley or Coach Snyder for kids who might never have anyone else believe in them. The letters I received over the years were the real measure of my impact. A young scientist who said my story inspired her to pursue her dreams despite discrimination. A businessman who overcame poverty because he learned from my example that excellence was possible regardless of circumstances. A teacher who used my story to show his students that barriers were meant to be broken. As I grew older and my running days became a memory, I realized that the race I had been running my entire life wasn't really about speed, it was about dignity. Every time I stepped onto a track, I was running not just for medals or records, but for the simple recognition that I was a human being worthy of respect. That race continues today, run by new generations of athletes and activists, scientists and teachers, mothers and fathers who refuse to let their children's potential be limited by the prejudices of others. Sometimes the progress feels frustratingly slow, But I think about how far we've come from that day in 1936, when a black athlete's victories in Nazi Germany were seen as a revolutionary act. I think about Barack Obama becoming president of the United States, something that would have been unimaginable when I was running in Berlin. I think about athletes like Serena Williams and LeBron James, who not only dominate their sports, but use their platforms to speak out on social issues without apology. I think about the young people today who take for granted opportunities that my generation could only dream of. But I also think about the work that remains to be done, the barriers that still exist, the subtle and not so subtle forms of discrimination that persist. The race for true equality is not a sprint, it's a marathon that spans generations. If I could sit down with my 9-year-old self, the boy running to catch that streetcar in Cleveland, I would tell him a few things. First, that speed is a gift, but character is a choice. Being fast made me famous, but how I chose to use that fame determined whether it had meaning. Second, that excellence is the most powerful form of protest. When you perform at a level that cannot be denied or dismissed, you force people to confront their own prejudices. You make them question the assumptions they've built their worldview on. Third, that individual success is meaningful only when it opens doors for others. My 4 gold medals mattered not because they made me rich or famous, but because they proved to millions of people that greatness comes in all colors. Fourth, that the race for dignity and respect is never really finished. Each generation has to run their leg of the race, pushing the baton forward for those who come after. And finally, that sometimes the most important victories happen not when you cross the finish line first, but when you help someone else discover they can run at all. When I died in 1980, I hoped that my epitaph would read not just that I was fast, but that I used my speed to carry others forward. That I ran not just for medals, but for the possibility that America could one day live up to its promise that all people are created equal. The boy from Alabama who was told he couldn't compete because of the color of his skin became the man who proved that excellence has no color. But more than that, I became someone who understood that our individual talents are gifts we're meant to share with the world, tools we can use to build bridges across the deepest divides of human misunderstanding. That's the real story of Jesse Owens, not just of a man who could run fast, but of someone who learned that the most important race is the one we run together, toward a world where every child can dream of being their best self, regardless of where they come from or what they look like. The track was where I found my speed, but life was where I found my purpose. And in the end, that purpose was simple: to show that when we race toward our highest potential, we all finish as winners. Jesse Owens won 4 gold medals at the 1936 Berlin Olympics, setting Olympic records in the 100 meters, 200 meters, long jump, and 4x 100-meter relay. His achievements challenged Nazi theories of racial superiority and inspired generations of athletes and activists. He died in 1980, having spent his later years promoting youth athletics and education through the Jesse Owens Foundation.